The blood had soaked through the threadbare cotton wrapped around Clara Ashford's palms by the time the massive stranger walked through the door of Mrs. Henderson's laundry house, and she knew without looking up that her body had finally reached its limit. She had been scrubbing clothes in scalding water for 14 hours straight, her fingers split open from the lye soap and rough fabric, her back screaming from bending over the washboards. But she could not stop, because stopping meant no payment, and no payment meant no food. The year was 1867, and Fort Kearny, Nebraska, was a rough outpost town where a woman alone had exactly two choices: work herself to death or sell herself to survive. And Clara had chosen the former with a stubborn pride that her mother would have recognized. "Madam, your hands," a voice rumbled above her, deep as thunder rolling across the plains, and Clara finally looked up from the tub of steaming water to find herself staring at the broadest chest she had ever seen encased in buckskin and flannel. "I am working," she said, her voice hoarse from the steam and exhaustion. "Mrs. Henderson does not allow interruptions during business hours." The man was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the doorway. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves that looked like they had been cut with a hunting knife, and his face was all hard angles and weathered bronze skin that spoke of years spent under the unforgiving sun. His eyes, though, were surprisingly gentle as they fixed on her bleeding hands, a warm brown that reminded her of honey in sunlight. "Mrs. Henderson can take her rules and choke on them," he said flatly. "You are bleeding into the wash water." Clara jerked her hands out of the tub as if scalded, wrapping them quickly in her apron to hide the evidence. Mrs. Henderson had already threatened to dock her pay for ruining 3 shirts with bloodstains last week. "Please leave. I cannot afford to lose this position." Instead of leaving, the mountain man reached into the leather satchel hanging at his hip and pulled out a small tin container. He moved with surprising swiftness for someone his size, catching Clara's wrist before she could pull away and gently unwrapping the sodden apron from her hands. What he revealed made his jaw tighten visibly. Her palms were a mess of cracked skin, open sores, and fresh bleeding cuts that crisscrossed her fingers like a map of her desperation. "How long have you been working like this?" he demanded. "That is none of your concern, sir." Clara tried to pull her hands back, but his grip, while gentle, was immovable as granite. "Virgil Zarrick," he said. "And it became my concern the moment I walked in here and saw a woman destroying herself for someone else's profit." He opened the tin, and the smell of pine and something medicinal filled the air between them. The salve inside was pale yellow, thick as butter, and when he scooped some onto his calloused fingers, Clara found herself holding her breath. No one had touched her with tenderness since her father died 2 years ago, since she had made the long journey west from Pennsylvania, only to have her intended husband take one look at her travel-worn appearance and declare the engagement terminated. "This will hurt at first," Virgil warned, and then his fingers were spreading the salve across her ravaged palms with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so large and scarred. Clara bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. The salve burned like liquid fire across the open wounds, but beneath the initial pain, she could feel something else, a cooling sensation that began to chase away the constant throbbing ache she had learned to live with. Virgil worked in silence, his massive hands steady as he covered every cut, every crack, every bleeding knuckle with the healing mixture. "What is this made from?" Clara finally asked, more to distract herself from the intimacy of the moment than from genuine curiosity. "Bear fat, pine resin, yarrow, and a few other things an old Pawnee medicine woman taught me to gather." Virgil did not look up from his work. "I trap in the mountains west of here, Come into town maybe 4 times a year for supplies. This salve has saved my life more times than I can count. And you carry it in your satchel for injured laundresses." The corner of his mouth quirked up, not quite a smile but close enough to transform his harsh features into something approaching handsome. "I carry it because the mountains do not care about your comfort. Frostbite, cuts, burns, infected wounds. This handles most of it." He finished with her hands and pulled a clean strip of cloth from his satchel, wrapping each palm with practiced efficiency. Clara watched his face as he worked, noting the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the deeper one along his jawline, the way his hair fell forward to hide his expression. Everything about him spoke of survival, of a man who had learned to rely only on himself in a world that offered no mercy to the weak. "There," Virgil said, securing the last bandage. "You need to let these heal for at least 3 days before you put them in water again." Clara laughed, a brittle sound without humor. 3 days without work means 3 days without pay, which means 3 days without food or rent. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Zarrick, but I cannot afford your help." She started to turn back to the washtub, but Virgil caught her shoulder. "What is your wage here?" $2 a week plus lodging in the back room." His expression darkened. $2 for this." He gestured at the mountains of soiled laundry piled around the room, at the steam rising from multiple tubs, at the evidence of brutal labor that would break most men within a week. "How many hours do you work?" 14 to 16 hours daily, 6 days a week. "Sundays I have off from noon until evening prayer." Clara lifted her chin, daring him to pity her. "It is honest work. It is exploitation." Virgil released her shoulder but did not step back. "I will pay you $6 to let your hands heal for 3 days. In return, you can cook meals for me while I conduct my business in town. I am staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street, and Mrs. Kowalski's cooking could kill a man with a stronger stomach than mine." Pride and desperation warred in Clara's chest. "I do not need charity, Mr. Zarrick." "Good, because I am not offering it. I am offering employment. I need someone who can cook actual food instead of the leather Mrs. Kowalski tries to pass off as beef. You need time to heal. This is business." Before Clara could answer, the door to the back office slammed open and Mrs. Henderson emerged, her face already twisted into its customary expression of displeasure. She was a thin woman who seemed to have been carved from vinegar and spite, with eyes that could find fault in fresh snow and a voice like a rusted saw. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her gaze darting between Clara and Virgil. "Clara, get back to work immediately. And you, sir, this is a respectable establishment. We do not allow men to loiter while the girls are working." Virgil turned to face Mrs. Henderson, and Clara saw the older woman take an involuntary step backward. There was something primal in the way Virgil held himself, a sense of contained power that made him seem even larger than his already considerable size. This was a man who had fought wolves and bears, who had survived blizzards and droughts, who had killed when necessary and thought nothing of it. "Clara Ashford is leaving your employment," Virgil said, his voice calm but utterly inflexible. "You can consider this her notice." "She most certainly is not," Mrs. Henderson sputtered. "Clara, if you walk out that door, you will never work in this town again. I will make certain of it." Clara looked at her bandaged hands, then at the washtubs, then at Mrs. Henderson's pinched face. She thought about the tiny room behind the laundry where she slept on a straw mattress, about the meals of bread and weak broth that left her constantly hungry, about the fact that she was 22 years old and could already feel her body breaking down from the relentless labor. "Then I suppose I will have to find work elsewhere," Clara heard herself say, and the words seemed to come from somewhere outside her body, spoken by a braver version of herself. "Thank you for the employment, Mrs. Henderson, but I resign my position effective immediately." The look of shock on Mrs. Henderson's face was almost worth the terror that flooded through Clara's veins as she untied her apron and hung it on the peg by the door. She owned almost nothing, her belongings packed into a single carpet bag that she retrieved from the back room while Mrs. Henderson shrieked threats and insults. When Clara emerged, Virgil simply took the bag from her hand and gestured toward the door. The afternoon sunlight was blinding after the steam-filled dimness of the laundry, and Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk trying to remember how to breathe. She had just quit the only job she had been able to find in 8 months of searching. She had nowhere to sleep tonight. She had less than 30 cents to her name, and she had just agreed to work for a complete stranger who could be leading her to any kind of fate. Having second thoughts, Virgil asked, his voice surprisingly understanding. "Approximately 1,000 of them," Clara admitted. He smiled then, a real smile that creased the corners of his eyes and made him look younger than his weathered appearance suggested. "That is fair. For what it is worth, I give you my word that you will come to no harm while in my employ. I will arrange for you to have your own room at the boarding house, door that locks from the inside. All I want is some decent food and someone to talk to, who does not spend the entire conversation trying to sell me watered-down whiskey." They walked through Fort Kearny's dusty streets, past the general store and the blacksmith shop, past the saloons where piano music drifted out into the afternoon air. Soldiers from the nearby fort wandered in groups, and freight wagons rolled toward the depot where goods would be loaded for the long journey west. Clara had arrived in this town 8 months ago with hope in her heart and a promise of marriage from a man she had never met. That man, a shopkeeper named Gerald, had taken one look at her and declared that she was not pretty enough to justify the expense of a wife. She had been surviving on scraps and spite ever since. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had been painted white at some point in its history, but now wore the same dusty brown color as everything else in town. Mrs. Kowalski, a round Polish woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked between Clara and Virgil with raised eyebrows. "You finally decided to take a wife, Zarrick?" she asked in heavily accented English. "I hired a cook," Virgil corrected. "Miss Ashford will need her own room, something with a good lock." Mrs. Kowalski's expression softened as she looked at Clara's bandaged hands. "Room 4, top of the stairs on the left. Clean sheets, good lock like he said. Meals are included in the weekly rate, but if you are cooking for this mountain bear, I will give you use of my private kitchen. The boarding house kitchen is too small for serious cooking." Within an hour, Clara found herself in a small but clean room with actual glass in the window and a bed that had a real mattress stuffed with corn husks instead of just straw. Virgil had paid for a week in advance, then left her to rest while he attended to his business. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped her hands to look at the damage beneath the bandages. The salve had worked some kind of miracle. The worst of the bleeding had stopped, and the angry red inflammation that had surrounded each cut had faded to pink. The cracks in her skin no longer gaped open, and when she flexed her fingers experimentally, the pain had diminished from agony to merely uncomfortable. She rewrapped her hands carefully and lay back on the bed, intending to rest for just a moment. When she woke, the room was dark and someone was knocking softly on her door. Clara stumbled to answer it, her body stiff from sleeping in one position, and found Virgil standing in the hallway with a tray of food. "Mrs. Kowalski said you missed dinner," he said. "Thought you might be hungry." The tray held thick slices of bread, butter, cold chicken, cheese, and an apple. It was more food than Clara had seen in one place in months, and her stomach cramped painfully at the sight of it. She stepped back to let Virgil enter, suddenly aware that she was alone in a bedroom with a man she barely knew. But Virgil simply set the tray on the small table by the window and moved toward the door. "Wait," Clara said. Would you care to join me? There is far too much here for one person." Virgil hesitated, then nodded and pulled the room's only chair over to the table while Clara sat on the bed. They ate in silence for a few minutes, Clara trying not to devour the food like a starving animal while Virgil watched the street below through the window. "Why did you help me?" Clara finally asked. "You do not know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible cook." "You could be," Virgil agreed. "But I watched you work for 10 minutes before I approached you. You moved efficiently, never wasted motion, kept checking the water temperature and the cleanliness of each piece, even though your hands were destroying themselves. Someone taught you to take pride in your work, which means someone taught you properly. That translates to cooking." "My mother," Clara said softly. "She ran a boarding house in Philadelphia before she died. She always said that any work worth doing was worth doing well, even if no one else would notice the difference. She was right." Virgil turned from the window to look at her directly. "Why are you out here alone? No family?" The question opened old wounds, but Clara found herself answering anyway. "My father was a carpenter. Good one too, but he drank. After my mother died, he got worse, started missing work, spending everything on whiskey. When he died, there were debts I could not pay. A friend of my mother's knew a man out here who was looking for a wife, corresponded with him on my behalf. Gerald Pritchard, he owned a dry goods store. We exchanged letters for 6 months, and he seemed kind. He paid for my passage west. What happened when you arrived?" Clara laughed bitterly. "He took one look at me and said I was not what he expected. Too thin, too plain, too worn out from the journey. He said he would not marry me but would help me find employment as a Christian duty. The only work available was at Mrs. Henderson's laundry." She looked down at her bandaged hands. "I have been there ever since, trying to save enough money to buy passage somewhere else. Anywhere else." Virgil's expression was unreadable, but his hands had curled into fists on the table. "This Gerald Pritchard, does he still own the dry goods store on Main Street?" "Yes, but please do not confront him. It will only make things worse for me." "I am not going to confront him," Virgil said quietly. "I am going to make sure I never spend another cent in his establishment, and I am going to encourage everyone I know to do the same. A man who would treat a woman that way does not deserve to prosper." They finished the meal, and Virgil left soon after, but not before showing Clara where Mrs. Kowalski's private kitchen was located and giving her money to purchase whatever ingredients she needed from the general store. That night, Clara lay in her clean bed with her stomach full for the first time in months and wondered if she had finally found a piece of good fortune, or if this was just a brief respite before the next disaster. Morning came bright and cold, and Clara woke to find her hands still bandaged, but feeling better than they had in weeks. She changed the dressings carefully, applying more of the salve that Virgil had left with her, and marveled at how much the wounds had already healed. Then she dressed in her best dress, which was still patched and faded but at least clean, and made her way downstairs to Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen. The Polish woman showed her where everything was stored, explained the temperament of the cast iron stove, and left her to work. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen and felt something unfold in her chest that she barely recognized as happiness. This was a real kitchen, well-stocked and well-maintained, a place where someone could create actual meals instead of just boiling laundry in huge vats. She made a list of additional items she would need and walked to the general store. carefully avoiding the dry goods establishment where Gerald Pritchard would be opening his shop. The general store owner, Mr. Chen, was a Chinese immigrant who had come to Nebraska with the railroad workers and stayed to open his business. He sold her flour, eggs, bacon, potatoes, onions, and fresh cream without comment on her bandaged hands, and even threw in a small bag of precious white sugar when she mentioned she was cooking for Virgil Zarrick. "That man saved my son's life 2 winters ago," Mr. Chen said in careful English. "My boy got lost in a blizzard. Virgil found him and carried him back to town on his shoulders through 3 miles of snow. You take good care of him." Clara promised she would and returned to the boarding house kitchen with renewed purpose. She had been raised in her mother's kitchen, had learned to coax flavor from the simplest ingredients, had been taught that feeding people was an act of love and care that mattered more than most folks realized. Now she set to work creating the kind of breakfast that a mountain man would appreciate. When Virgil came downstairs 2 hours later, the kitchen smelled like heaven. Clara had made a feast: eggs scrambled with cream and butter, thick slices of bacon fried crisp, potatoes fried with onions until golden brown, fresh bread she had begged from Mrs. Kowalski's stores and toasted over the fire, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Virgil stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly. "That smells like something my mother used to make." "Your mother was from where?" Clara asked, plating the food with hands that barely hurt despite the work. "Pennsylvania originally. Dutch country. She married my father and moved west before I was born, lived in a cabin in the Montana Territory until she died when I was 15. Virgil sat at the kitchen table, which Clara had set with proper plates and silverware. She used to make breakfast like this on Sunday mornings, said it was important to start the Lord's day properly fed. They ate together, and Clara watched Virgil's face transform as he tasted the food. He ate with the single-minded focus of a man who was accustomed to viewing meals as fuel rather than pleasure, but she could see the appreciation in his eyes. When he finally pushed back from the empty plate, he looked at her with something approaching wonder. "Miss Ashford, that was the finest meal I have had in 10 years. Clara felt warmth flood her cheeks. "It was just breakfast, Mr. Zarrick." "No," he said firmly. "It was breakfast made by someone who cares about the craft. There is a difference." He stood and began clearing the dishes, ignoring Clara's protests. "I need to meet with some buyers this morning, discuss prices for my furs. Will you be all right here on your own?" "Of course. I am perfectly capable of occupying myself." "I know you are." Virgil dried his hands on a towel. "But if you need anything, if anyone bothers you, you tell Mrs. Kowalski. She keeps a shotgun behind the front desk and is not afraid to use it." He left, and Clara spent the rest of the morning cleaning the kitchen and planning the evening meal. She had not realized how much she had missed this, the creative challenge of building flavors, the satisfaction of preparing something with care and skill. At the laundry, every day had been identical, a gray blur of pain and exhaustion. Here, she could think again, plan, imagine possibilities beyond simple survival. That afternoon, she walked through Fort Kearny streets with a basket on her arm, visiting the various shops and vendors to see what ingredients were available. The town was busier than she had realized, a crossroads where settlers heading west met soldiers guarding the frontier, where traders and trappers came to sell their goods and ranchers drove cattle to market. She saw Pawnee women selling beadwork and dried corn, Mexican vaqueros bargaining for saddles, freed slaves who had come west seeking opportunities denied to them in the South. As Clara was examining a vendor's selection of dried herbs, a woman's voice called out behind her. "Clara. Clara Ashford, is that you?" She turned to find Margaret Sullivan, one of the other laundresses from Mrs. Henderson's establishment, hurrying toward her with a shocked expression. Margaret was a few years older than Clara, a widow whose husband had died of cholera on the wagon train west. They had shared the occasional conversation during their brief lunch breaks, though Mrs. Henderson discouraged fraternization among the workers. "Margaret, how are you?" Clara asked, genuinely pleased to see a familiar face. "How am I? The question is, how are you?" Margaret grabbed Clara's arm, her fingers rough and cracked from the same work that had destroyed Clara's hands. "Mrs. Henderson has been ranting all morning about your betrayal, saying you seduced some rich trapper into rescuing you. She docked everyone's pay to make up for losing you." Margaret's expression turned worried. "Is it true? Did you really leave with that massive man?" "I took employment as his cook," Clara said carefully. "Mr. Zarrick offered better wages and the opportunity for my hands to heal." Margaret looked at Clara's bandaged hands with envy. "He must be paying you well indeed. Are you having to, you know?" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "No," Clara said firmly. "Mr. Zarrick has been nothing but respectful. He gave me my own room with a lock, pays me fairly, and treats me like a human being rather than a machine that produces clean laundry." "Then he is a rare man indeed," Margaret sighed. "I should get back before Mrs. Henderson adds my shopping time to my list of sins. But Clara, be careful. Men like that, mountain men who live alone, they can be dangerous when they decide they want something." Clara thought about Virgil's gentle hands tending her wounds, the way he had respected her space, the quiet sadness in his voice when he spoke of his mother. "I think he has been alone so long that he has forgotten how to be anything but careful," she said softly. She returned to the boarding house and spent the afternoon preparing a dinner that would rival anything served in a fine restaurant. She made a beef stew rich with vegetables and herbs, biscuits light as clouds, and a dried apple pie sweetened with the precious sugar she had purchased. When Virgil returned as the sun was setting, his face lined with exhaustion from a day of hard bargaining, the smell of home-cooked food seemed to revive him. They ate dinner together in Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen, and this time the conversation flowed more easily. Virgil told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands beside a creek that ran cold and clear year-round. He spoke of tracking elk through deep snow, of the eerie beauty of a forest full of ice-covered trees, of the crushing loneliness that sometimes descended during the long winter months when he might go weeks without seeing another human being. "Why do you do it?" Clara asked. "Stay out there alone, I mean. Surely there are easier ways to make a living." Virgil was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his large hands. "After my mother died, my father remarried quickly. New wife did not want a nearly grown stepson around, especially one who looked so much like the first wife. My father gave me a rifle, some traps, and told me it was time I made my own way. I was 15 years old." He smiled without humor. "I wandered for a few years, learned trapping from an old French Canadian, nearly died more times than I can count. But somewhere in all that, I found I preferred the honesty of the wilderness. Animals do not lie, do not cheat, do not pretend to care about you while plotting to use you. They might kill you, but they will be straightforward about it. That is a hard way to live," Clara said softly. "It is the only way I know." Virgil met her eyes across the table. "Until yesterday, I would have said I was content with it. But sitting here, eating food made by someone who cares enough to make it properly, talking to someone who listens like my words matter, I am starting to remember what I have been missing." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Clara found herself noticing details she had been too exhausted and frightened to see before. The way lamplight turned Virgil's brown eyes to amber, the silver just beginning to thread through his dark hair at his temples, the unexpected grace in his scarred hands. He was perhaps 30 years old, she estimated, which made him 8 years her senior, old enough to have gained wisdom, young enough to still have a future. "How long do you stay in town?" Clara asked, breaking the moment before it could become too intense. "Usually about a week. Need to sell my furs, buy supplies, arrange for goods to be held until spring when I come back down." Virgil hesitated. "This time might be different, though." "How so?" "This time I have a reason to consider staying longer." He said it simply, without artifice, and Clara felt her heartbeat accelerate. Over the next 3 days, they fell into a rhythm that felt dangerously like domesticity. Clara cooked 3 meals daily, each one better than the last, and Virgil ate everything she prepared with obvious appreciation. Between meals, they talked. Virgil told her about the mountains, painting pictures with his words of landscapes so beautiful they made her heart ache. Clara spoke of her childhood in Philadelphia, of her mother's kindness and her father's slow descent into despair, of the books she had loved to read, and the dreams she had once harbored of becoming a teacher. "You still could," Virgil pointed out on the 3rd evening as they washed dishes together. Clara's hands had healed enough that she could help with simple tasks, though Virgil still insisted on doing anything that involved rough scrubbing. "Teach, I mean. Fort Kearny has children who need education." "It requires certification I do not have," Clara said. "And even if I had the credentials, no school board would hire a woman with my background. Former laundress, abandoned by her intended no family connections. I am permanently marked as unsuitable." Virgil's hand stilled in the dishwater. "That is a vicious way of thinking." "That is reality for women in 1867. Clara dried a plate with more force than necessary. "We are judged not on our capabilities but on our circumstances. A man can overcome a difficult past, can remake himself into someone new. A woman carries her past like a brand that everyone can see." "Then society is wrong and needs to change." Clara smiled despite her frustration. "You have been in the mountains too long, Mr. Zarrick. You have forgotten how rigid the world down here can be. Or maybe I remember how arbitrary those rigid rules are and refuse to respect them." Virgil pulled his hands from the water and turned to face her fully. "You are intelligent, educated, skilled, and hardworking. Anyone who cannot see your worth because of circumstances beyond your control is a fool." "That is a lovely sentiment, but it does not change reality." "Maybe not," Virgil conceded. "But it changes how you respond to that reality. You can accept their judgment and spend the rest of your life scrubbing other people's laundry, or you can make your own path regardless of what they think." "Easy to say when you are a man who can simply walk away into the wilderness," Clara shot back, then immediately regretted the harshness of her tone. "I apologize. That was unfair." "It was accurate," Virgil said quietly. "I have freedoms you do not, simply by accident of birth." "But Clara, you have more options than you realize. You do not have to go back to Mrs. Henderson's laundry." "What other choice do I have? Even your generosity will end eventually." Virgil opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. "Let us finish these dishes," he said instead. "Then I want to show you something." 20 minutes later, they were walking through Fort Kearny streets under a sky full of stars. The town was quieter at night, though music and laughter still drifted from the saloons, and soldiers on patrol nodded respectfully as they passed. Virgil led Clara to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie, and there he stopped and pointed west. "See that?" he asked. Clara looked but saw only darkness. "I see nothing." "Exactly. Out there, beyond what you can see in the dark, are the mountains. Miles and miles of land that belongs to no one or to everyone, depending on how you look at it. No Mrs. Henderson, no Gerald Pritchard, no society ladies judging whether you are suitable. Just space to breathe and be yourself. It sounds lonely, Clara said honestly. It is, Virgil admitted. That is why I keep coming back to town, keep trying to find a reason to stay among people even though they complicate everything. Humans are not meant to be completely alone. We need connection, need to matter to someone other than ourselves. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was all shadows and angles. You matter, Clara. Maybe you do not believe that yet, but you do. You matter to me. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Mr. Zarrick, Virgil, he interrupted, please. I think we have moved past formalities. Virgil, she corrected, tasting his name on her tongue and finding she liked the feel of it. You barely know me. I know you work until your hands bleed. I know you take pride in even the smallest tasks. I know you are brave enough to walk away from certain misery toward an uncertain future. I know that when you smile, which is not often enough, your whole face lights up. He took a step closer. I know that I have been alone in those mountains for 15 years, and in 3 days you have made me question whether isolation is really the life I want. I do not know what to say to that, Clara whispered. You do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that you have value, Clara Ashford, more value than any of these town folks can see. Virgil stepped back, giving her space. We should return. I do not want anyone getting the wrong idea about our arrangement. They walked back to the boarding house in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, full of possibilities neither of them was quite ready to name. When they reached Clara's room, Virgil paused. Your hands are healing well, he observed. Another few days and you will be able to work normally again. Thanks to your salve and your kindness. When they are fully healed, you will need to make a decision about what comes next. I want you to know that whatever you choose, I will help you. If you want to stay in Fort Kearny and find other work, I will provide references and enough money to get you started. If you want to travel somewhere else, I will arrange safe passage and enough funds to establish yourself. And if I wanted to do something else entirely? Clara asked, her heart pounding. Virgil's eyes searched her face. What else might you want? I do not know yet, Clara admitted, but I find myself considering options I would have dismissed as impossible just a few days ago. He smiled, and again she was struck by how it transformed him from intimidating to approachable. Good. You should consider impossible things. Some of them turn out to be less impossible than they appear. The next morning, Clara woke to find a package wrapped in brown paper outside her door. Inside was a dress, simple but well made in a deep blue cotton that would bring out her eyes, along with a warm shawl and a new pair of leather gloves sized for a woman's hands. There was no note, but Clara knew who had left it. She pressed the soft fabric to her face and allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine a future that included more than just survival. She wore the dress to breakfast, and the way Virgil's face lit up when he saw her made the boldness worthwhile. They ate together as usual, but today, the conversation took a different turn. Virgil began asking her questions about what she enjoyed, what she had dreamed of as a child, what would make her happy if she could choose anything in the world. I used to imagine having a home, Clara said slowly, the words coming from a place she usually kept locked away. Not a grand house, just a place that was mine. A kitchen where I could cook what I wanted, a garden where I could grow herbs and vegetables, maybe some chickens for eggs. A place where I could wake up and not immediately calculate how many hours I had to work before I could rest again. That does not sound impossible, Virgil said. It is when you are a single woman with no money and no prospects. What if you were not single? Clara's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. "I beg your pardon." Virgil set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I am not good at pretty words or courtship rituals. I have spent too much time alone to remember how civilized people do these things. But I am going to speak plainly, and you can tell me if I am being a fool." Clara could not speak, could only nod for him to continue. "I came to Fort Kearny planning to sell my furs, buy supplies, and return to my cabin before the first snow. That was my life, my routine, repeated twice a year for the past 15 years. Then I walked into that laundry house and saw you destroying yourself for pennies, and something in me decided that routine was no longer acceptable." Virgil's voice was steady but intense. "These past few days, eating your food, talking with you, just being in your presence, I have felt more alive than I have in years. You make me want to be more than just a man who survives in the wilderness. You make me want to build something, create a life instead of just enduring one." "Virgil," Clara started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish before I lose my courage. I am offering you a choice, a real choice with no pressure. You can take the help I offered and go make your own way in the world, or you can marry me and come with me to the mountains. I will not pretend it would be easy. The cabin is small and rough, the winters are brutal, and you would be isolated from society for months at a time. But you would have that home you described. You would have space to garden when the weather allows, as many chickens as you want, and a kitchen that belongs to you. Most importantly, you would have me, and I would spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "You are proposing marriage after knowing me for 4 days. I am proposing a partnership between two people who understand hardship and survival, who see value in each other when the rest of the world tried to break them down. I am not offering romance or passion, though I would certainly not object to either developing over time. I am offering stability, respect, and the promise that you will never have to scrub laundry until your hands bleed ever again. That is possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of courtship," Clara said faintly. Virgil's expression turned rueful. "I warned you I was not good at pretty words, but it might also be the most honest one." Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at Fort Kearny's dusty streets. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's laundry, about the constant pain and exhaustion, about the slow death of working yourself into an early grave. Then she thought about Virgil's mountains, about space to breathe and the freedom to live on her own terms. She thought about his hands, so gentle despite their size and strength, and the way he had cared for her wounds without asking for anything in return. "I do not love you," she said, still facing the window. "I know," Virgil replied calmly. "I do not even know you, not really. Also true, this could be a terrible mistake." "It could be," Virgil agreed, "but so could spending the rest of your life afraid to take a chance on something better." Clara turned to face him. "If I agreed to this, I would have conditions. Name them." "I would want my own space in the cabin, somewhere I can retreat when I need time alone. I would want respect, not ownership. I would want the freedom to leave if things do not work out, with no recriminations or attempts to force me to stay." She took a deep breath. "And I would want honesty between us, always. No hidden expectations, no silences that breed resentment." Virgil stood and crossed to where she stood. "I can agree to all of that. And I would add one condition of my own, that you give this a genuine chance. Not forever, but at least 1 full year. Come to the mountains with me, see what that life is truly like, and then decide if it is what you want. If after a year you want to leave, I will bring you back to civilization and give you enough money to start over properly." 1 year, Clara repeated. 1 year. "And Clara, understand that I am not looking for a servant or a housekeeper who happens to share my bed. I want a partner, someone to share the work and the hardships and hopefully the joys as well. I will teach you to trap, to hunt, to survive in the wilderness. You will teach me to be civilized again, to remember what it means to care for someone other than myself. We will build something together, or we will fail together, but either way we will be honest about it. Clara looked at this man who had walked into her life 4 days ago and turned everything upside down. He was offering her a wildly impractical solution to her problems, a choice that made no logical sense. But then again, nothing in her life had made logical sense for a long time. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts over your reason. Yes, she heard herself say. I will marry you, Virgil Zarrick. I will give you your year and see what we can build together. The smile that spread across Virgil's face was like sunrise over the plains, bright and full of promise. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he took her hands gently in his. You will not regret this, Clara. I swear it. I am already regretting it a little, she admitted. But I find that I am also excited, which is an emotion I had almost forgotten existed. They were married 3 days later by the Army chaplain at Fort Kearny, with Mrs. Kowalski and Mr. Chen as witnesses. Clara wore the blue dress Virgil had given her, and Virgil had gotten a haircut and trimmed his beard, transforming from mountain man to something approaching respectable. The ceremony was brief and practical. The chaplain clearly accustomed to marrying couples who were more focused on survival than romance. When the chaplain pronounced them married, Virgil kissed Clara's forehead with surprising tenderness and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." They spent their wedding night in separate rooms, honoring Clara's request for her own space. But the next morning they began the practical work of preparing for the journey to Virgil's cabin. He took Clara to the general store and outfitted her with sturdy clothing appropriate for mountain life. Heavy canvas trousers that scandalized the shopkeeper's wife, flannel shirts, wool socks, and boots built for serious walking. He bought her a warm coat lined with rabbit fur, gloves and mittens, and a hat that would protect her from sun and snow alike. "You look like a proper mountain woman," Virgil said with approval as Clara modeled the outfit. "I look like I am about to rob a stagecoach," Clara corrected. But she had to admit the clothes were comfortable in a way her corsets and long skirts had never been. They purchased supplies systematically: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, dried beans, cornmeal, lard, and anything else that would keep through a long winter. Virgil bought ammunition for his rifles, new traps to replace ones that had worn out, tools for repairs and building. He consulted Clara on every purchase, asking her opinion and deferring to her judgment on household goods. Margaret found Clara on the 3rd day of preparations, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been envy. "Is it true? Did you really marry that mountain man?" "I did," Clara confirmed, holding up her left hand to show the simple gold band Virgil had purchased from the fort's trading post. "But why? You barely know him." "I know him well enough to know he will never ask me to work until my hands bleed. That is more than enough for now." Clara softened her tone. "Margaret, he is a good man. Strange and solitary, yes, but good. He treats me like I matter." "And when you are trapped in some cabin miles from anywhere, will you still think he is good?" Margaret asked. "What happens when winter comes and you are completely dependent on him for survival?" It was a fair question, and one Clara had asked herself repeatedly over the past week. "I suppose I will find out. But Margaret, staying here was killing me slowly. At least this way I am choosing my own fate." Margaret hugged her fiercely. "Then I wish you happiness, truly. You deserve some after everything you have endured." The night before they were scheduled to leave, Clara stood at her window looking at Fort Kearny's lights and wondering if she would ever see civilization again. There was a knock at her door, and she opened it to find Virgil standing in the hallway looking uncertain. "Am I disturbing you?" he asked. "No, please come in." Clara stepped back to let him enter. Virgil handed her a package wrapped in oilcloth. "I wanted you to have this before we left, in case you changed your mind about coming." Inside the package was a thick stack of bills, more money than Clara had ever seen in one place. "What is this?" "Your freedom," Virgil said simply. "Enough money to go anywhere you want, start any kind of life you choose. I want you to keep it on your person at all times. If we get to the cabin and you realize you have made a terrible mistake, you will have the means to leave. You are not a prisoner, Clara. You are my wife, and that means you are my equal partner with equal say in our life together." Clara looked at the money, then at Virgil's earnest face. "You would really give me the means to leave you. I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you have no other options. That money is yours, no strings attached. Use it to leave me, use it to start a business, use it to go back east, or do not use it at all, but know that you always have a choice." It was perhaps the most significant gesture anyone had ever made toward Clara, this acknowledgement that her agency and freedom mattered more than Virgil's desires. She carefully rewrapped the money and tucked it into the secret pocket she had sewn into her new coat. "Thank you, Virgil. This means more than you know. I think I have some idea." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Clara, I know this is not a traditional marriage. I know you did not marry me for love, but I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to make you happy. You took a chance on me when you had every reason to refuse. I will not waste that gift." After he left, Clara packed her few belongings and tried to calm her racing heart. Tomorrow she would leave Fort Kearny behind and venture into a completely unknown future. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. They departed at dawn, traveling in a sturdy wagon pulled by two massive draft horses that Virgil had purchased specifically for the journey. Everything they owned was packed into that wagon: supplies, tools, Clara's carpetbag, and Virgil's furs that he had not yet sold. The plan was to travel northwest toward the Wyoming Territory, a journey of approximately 3 weeks through increasingly rough terrain. Fort Kearny disappeared behind them as they rolled across the prairie, and Clara watched it go with mixed emotions. That town had been the site of her greatest disappointments and deepest despair, but it had also been where she met Virgil. Now she was leaving it all behind for something completely unknown. Virgil drove the wagon with easy competence, his large hands gentle on the reins. He pointed out features of the landscape as they traveled, teaching Clara to read the land the way he did. That cluster of trees meant water nearby. That particular type of grass indicated good soil. Those birds circling meant a dead animal, which meant predators might be in the area. They traveled for 8 to 10 hours daily, stopping to make camp when the light began to fail. Virgil taught Clara how to build a proper fire, how to arrange their camp to minimize danger from wild animals, how to cook over an open flame. In return, Clara applied her cooking skills to their simple provisions, creating meals that made Virgil shake his head in wonder. "How do you make beans and bacon taste this good?" he asked one evening as they ate by the fire. "Spices," Clara said, "and caring about the result. Anyone can throw food in a pot, making it taste like something requires attention." As they traveled, they talked. Virgil told Clara stories about his years in the mountains, about the time he wrestled a wolf that attacked his horse, about the winter he got snowed into his cabin for 6 weeks straight, about the incredible beauty of the high country in spring when wildflowers covered entire meadows. Clara spoke of her childhood, of happy memories before her father's drinking destroyed their family, of books she had read and places she had dreamed of visiting. "You ever regret not having children?" Clara asked one night as they sat by the fire under a sky full of stars. Virgil was quiet for a moment. "I never allowed myself to think about it. Children require a mother, and I convinced myself I would never find a woman willing to share my life. Now, though," he glanced at her across the fire, "now I find myself imagining possibilities I had long ago dismissed." Clara felt her cheeks warm. They had been married for a week, but had not yet consummated their union. Virgil had been unfailingly respectful, even setting up their camp each night so that Clara had privacy to change and sleep. It was thoughtful and appreciated, but it also left a strange tension between them, an awareness of the physical aspect of their marriage that had not yet been addressed. "Virgil," Clara said slowly, "I appreciate your patience with me, but I want you to know that I understand what marriage entails. I am not afraid of you. I am glad to hear that, but I am in no rush, Clara. We have time to let things develop naturally." He stirred the fire with a stick. "I want our first time together to be because you want it, not because you think it is your duty." The conversation moved to other topics, but Clara found herself thinking about Virgil's words as she lay in her bedroll that night. He could have demanded his marital rights at any point, could have used his size and strength to force her compliance. Instead, he was giving her time and space to adjust to this new life. It was a gift she had not expected, and it made her regard her strange new husband with growing respect and something that might eventually become affection. They crossed into the Wyoming Territory after 12 days of travel, and the landscape began to change dramatically. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, then to steeper terrain with rocky outcroppings and dense forests of pine. The air grew thinner and colder, even though it was only September. Virgil pushed them harder now, aware that they needed to reach the cabin before the first serious snowfall. On the 15th day, they encountered another group of travelers, a family heading east in a battered wagon. The father had a haunted look that Clara recognized from her own time of desperation. Virgil pulled their wagon alongside and struck up a conversation. The family, the Johnsons, had tried to homestead in the mountains but failed when their crops died and their livestock was killed by a grizzly bear. Now they were heading back to Missouri, defeated and nearly broken. The children looked half-starved, and Mrs. Johnson had a cough that sounded ominous. Without consulting Clara, Virgil began pulling supplies from their wagon: a sack of flour, dried meat, a bag of beans, and a small pouch of precious white sugar. He handed them to Mr. Johnson, who stared at the goods with tears in his eyes. "I cannot pay you," the man said hoarsely. "Did not ask you to," Virgil replied. "Just get your family somewhere safe and take care of that woman's cough before it turns into something worse." As the Johnsons continued their journey east, Clara looked at Virgil with new eyes. "We just gave away a significant portion of our supplies." "We have enough to get through the winter if we are careful," Virgil said. "They needed it more." "You are a softer man than you pretend to be, Virgil Zarrick," he smiled slightly. "Do not spread that around. It would ruin my reputation as a hardened mountain man." They reached Virgil's cabin on the 18th day of travel, just as the first autumn snow was beginning to dust the higher peaks. Clara's first sight of what would be her home for the next year made her heart sink. Virgil had described it as small and rough, but she had not fully appreciated what that meant until she saw it. A single-room log structure maybe 20 feet square, with one small window and a chimney made of stacked stones. Virgil noticed her expression and winced. "I know it is not much. I never needed more than basic shelter. But we can improve it, add on another room, make it more comfortable. I am a decent carpenter when I have the materials and motivation." Clara forced herself to smile. It has walls and a roof, which is more than I had at Mrs. Henderson's laundry. We will make it work. Inside, the cabin was even more Spartan than Clara had feared. There was a simple bed frame with a straw mattress, a rough table with 2 chairs, a fireplace for cooking and heat, and shelves holding basic supplies. Everything was functional but utterly devoid of comfort or beauty. This was a place where a man survived, not lived. "Well," Clara said, setting down her bag, "I suppose we have our work cut out for us." Over the next several weeks, they transformed the cabin from a survival shelter into something approaching a home. Virgil built additional shelves and a proper counter for food preparation. He fashioned a privacy screen so Clara could section off part of the cabin for herself. He cut wood for winter, stacking it high against the cabin walls, and repaired the roof where it had leaked. Clara, meanwhile, attacked the interior with determination. She scrubbed every surface until the cabin smelled of lye soap instead of old grease and animal pelts. She made curtains from spare fabric to cover the window, sewed a quilt from scraps to brighten the bed, and organized their supplies with systematic efficiency. Virgil taught her the skills she would need to survive in the mountains. She learned to shoot his spare rifle, though her aim was poor at first and the recoil bruised her shoulder. She learned to identify animal tracks in the snow, to tell the difference between a deer trail and an elk path. She learned which plants were edible and which would kill you, which trees made the best firewood, how to preserve meat by smoking and drying. In return, Clara civilized their small space. She cooked proper meals even with limited ingredients, found ways to make their rough cabin feel more like a home, insisted on certain standards of cleanliness and order. She also pushed Virgil to remember how to be social, how to have conversations about things other than pure survival. They played cards in the evenings, Clara teaching Virgil the games her mother had taught her. She read aloud from the 3 books Virgil owned, giving voices to the characters and making him laugh with her dramatic interpretations. As autumn deepened into early winter, Clara found herself settling into their life with surprising ease. The work was hard, certainly, but it was varied and purposeful in a way that laundry had never been. She was building something here, creating a life rather than just surviving day to day. And Virgil, she was discovering, was an excellent partner. He never made decisions without consulting her, always did his share of the domestic work, and treated her opinions with the same respect he would give another man's. The first serious snowstorm hit in early November, trapping them inside the cabin for 3 days. Clara discovered that isolation was different from loneliness. Inside their small space, she and Virgil talked for hours, played endless games of cards, and worked on small projects. Virgil carved wooden spoons while Clara sewed and mended clothes. The intimacy of the situation should have been uncomfortable, but instead, Clara found it oddly peaceful. On the 3rd night of the storm, as they sat by the fire listening to wind howl outside, Virgil reached over and took Clara's hand. It was the first deliberately romantic gesture he had made since their wedding, and Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Are you happy here?" he asked quietly. "Tell me honestly." Clara considered the question seriously. "I am not unhappy, which is more than I could say for a long time. I miss certain aspects of civilization, other women to talk to, variety in our diet, access to books and news. But I do not miss the judgment, the constant struggle to survive, the feeling that I was worth less than nothing. Here I matter. My work matters. You listen when I speak and value my contributions. So yes, I suppose I am happy, or at least content." "Content is a start," Virgil said. "I was hoping for happy eventually." "And you?" Clara turned the question back on him. Are you happy having me here, or have I disrupted your solitary peace? You have absolutely disrupted my peace, Virgil said, but he smiled as he said it. I can no longer ignore the state of my clothing, or eat half-cooked meals, or go days without a real conversation. You have made me soft and civilized and dependent on your presence. It is terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Clara, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my adult life. Having you here, building this life together, it has given me something I did not know I was missing. You are an extraordinary woman, and I am grateful every day that you took a chance on me. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Virgil, he pulled her into his arms, and Clara went willingly, resting her head against his broad chest and feeling the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that for a long time, the storm raging outside while they created their own small haven of warmth and connection inside. That night, when Clara went to her sleeping area behind the privacy screen, Virgil followed. He did not push or demand, simply asked quietly, "May I stay with you tonight?" Clara looked at this man who had saved her from desperation, who had been patient and kind and respectful beyond anything she had expected. She thought about the connection that had been growing between them, the way her heart had begun to lift when he entered a room, the way she had started to notice the strength in his arms and the warmth in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "you may stay." Their joining was gentle and careful, Virgil taking his time to ensure Clara's comfort, speaking soft endearments against her hair. For Clara, who had never known physical intimacy before, it was a revelation. This was not the frightening duty she had been warned about, but rather a connection that felt natural and right. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that she had not experienced since her mother's death. The feeling of belonging somewhere. Winter deepened, and their life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Virgil checked his trap lines daily when the weather permitted, bringing back furs that he would process and prepare for sale in the spring. Clara maintained their home, cooked their meals, and continued learning the skills necessary for mountain survival. They worked together to keep paths clear to the woodpile and the small shed where they kept their horses. They hunted together, Clara's aim improving with practice until she could reliably bring down small game. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, sharing their pasts and imagining their futures. Virgil spoke of his dream to build a larger cabin, maybe start raising horses to sell to settlers. Clara talked about wanting a proper garden in the spring, about teaching Virgil to read better since his education had ended at age 15. "Why would I need to read better?" Virgil asked, amused. "Because I want someone to discuss books with," Clara replied. "And because any children we might have will need someone who can help them with their lessons." It was the first time either of them had mentioned children directly, and Virgil went still. "Do you want children, Clara?" "I think I might," she admitted. "Not right away, but eventually. Do you?" "I never thought I would," Virgil said slowly. "But now, thinking about a little girl with your eyes or a boy I could teach to track and hunt, yes, I want that very much." By midwinter, Clara knew she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable. Missed monthly courses, morning nausea, a strange exhaustion that hit her in the afternoons. She was afraid to tell Virgil at first, worried about how he would react, but when she finally worked up the courage, his response was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he repeated, his face transformed by wonder. "Clara, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it." Virgil swept her into his arms and spun her around the small cabin, his laughter echoing off the log walls. "We are going to have a baby. You and I are going to be parents. He set her down carefully, suddenly concerned. "Are you well? Should you be resting? What do you need?" Clara laughed at his instant transformation from celebrating to worrying. "I am fine, Virgil. Women have been having babies for thousands of years. I am healthy and strong, and we have months before the child arrives." But Virgil's protectiveness only increased as the pregnancy progressed. He insisted Clara rest more, took over the heavier chores entirely, and worried constantly about her health. When Clara complained that he was being overprotective, Virgil simply replied that she and the baby were the most precious things in his world and he would not apologize for caring. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in patches to reveal the earth beneath. As soon as the passes were clear enough for travel, Virgil insisted they make the journey to Fort Kearny so Clara could see a doctor and prepare for the birth. Clara, who had been feeling isolated despite her contentment, agreed readily. The trip took 3 weeks, slower than their journey the previous autumn because Virgil insisted on frequent stops to ensure Clara's comfort. When they finally rolled into Fort Kearny in late April, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. This place had been the site of so much pain, but it was also where her life had changed forever. The town doctor, a gruff man named Dr. Morrison, examined Clara and pronounced her healthy with a baby due in late summer. "You have been living in the mountains?" he asked, raising an eyebrow at Virgil. "Yes, sir," Virgil confirmed. "Then you better plan to stay in town for the birth. I do not deliver babies in wilderness cabins, and your wife should not be traveling this late in her pregnancy anyway." They rented a small house on the edge of town. Virgil, using the money from selling his winter's worth of furs to pay for 6 months in advance. He found work as a guide for settlers heading west, using his knowledge of the mountains to help them navigate safely. Clara, meanwhile, reconnected with the few people in Fort Kearny who had shown her kindness. Margaret was overjoyed to see her looking healthy and happy, and Mr. Chen gave her a jade pendant for the baby as a blessing. Mrs. Henderson, Clara learned, had lost her laundry business after multiple workers quit and word spread about her exploitative practices. The bitter woman had left town in disgrace, and Clara found she felt only pity for someone so consumed by greed that she destroyed her own livelihood. As Clara's pregnancy advanced, Virgil became almost comically protective. He accompanied her everywhere, glared at anyone who looked at her wrong, and spent his evenings preparing their small rented house for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He purchased tiny clothes and blankets, more than one baby could possibly need. And every night, he would place his hand on Clara's swollen belly and talk to their child, telling stories about the mountains and promising adventures to come. "You are going to spoil this baby terribly," Clara observed one evening as Virgil showed her yet another toy he had purchased. "That is my right as a father," Virgil replied cheerfully. "Besides, our child will have the best of both worlds, your intelligence and refinement plus my survival skills and knowledge of the wilderness. How can we not spoil someone so blessed?" Labor began on a hot August evening, and Virgil went pale when Clara gasped and doubled over with the first contraction. He ran for Dr. Morrison while Clara tried to remember everything she had heard about childbirth. The next 14 hours were the longest of her life, filled with pain and exhaustion and Virgil's constant presence. He held her hand, wiped her forehead, and refused to leave even when Dr. Morrison suggested it might be inappropriate for husbands to witness the birth. "She is my wife and that is my child," Virgil said firmly. "I am staying." When their son finally arrived just after dawn, red-faced and screaming with impressive lung power, Virgil wept openly. He held the tiny baby with hands that trembled, staring at his son's face as if memorizing every detail. "He is perfect," Virgil whispered. "Clara, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Victor, and he immediately became the center of their world. Virgil proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with Victor during fussy nights. Clara recovered quickly from the birth, her body strengthened by months of mountain living, and soon she was eager to return to their cabin. They left Fort Kearny when Victor was 6 weeks old, traveling slowly to accommodate their infant son. The journey back to the mountains felt different this time, less like fleeing to isolation and more like returning home. When their cabin came into view, Clara felt genuine joy. This was their place, their sanctuary, and now they would share it with their son. Winter came again, but this year they were better prepared. Virgil had built an addition to the cabin during the summer, giving them a separate bedroom and more living space. Clara had preserved vegetables from her garden and dried enough meat to supplement their supplies. Victor grew rapidly, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes. As the years passed, their life took on a pattern. They would spend most of the year in the mountains, then travel to Fort Kearny each spring for supplies and to sell Virgil's furs. Victor grew into a sturdy toddler who loved the wilderness, fearlessly exploring the areas around their cabin under his father's watchful eye. Clara taught him his letters and numbers while Virgil taught him to identify animal tracks and plants. When Victor was 3, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time the announcement was met with calm joy rather than shocked wonder. Their daughter was born the following summer, a tiny girl they named Catherine after Clara's mother. Catherine had her father's stubborn temperament and her mother's quick mind, and she ruled their small household with an iron will despite her small size. Virgil built another addition to the cabin, and Clara planted a larger garden. They acquired chickens, just as Clara had dreamed of years ago, and the sound of their clucking became part of the daily soundtrack of their lives. Other families had begun settling in the valleys below their cabin, drawn by the promise of land and freedom. Virgil helped the newcomers, teaching them survival skills and warning them about the challenges they would face. Clara organized occasional gatherings where the scattered mountain families could socialize, and she taught reading and basic mathematics to the children who had no access to formal schools. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Virgil and Clara sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Victor and Catherine were inside supposedly sleeping, though Clara suspected they were actually whispering to each other as children do. Their hands had grown rough with work over the years, but they were strong and capable hands that had built a life together. "You remember when you first walked into that laundry house?" Clara asked, her hand resting in Virgil's larger one. "Every detail," Virgil confirmed. "You looked so fierce, so determined not to show weakness even though you were clearly suffering. I fell in love with you in that moment, though I did not realize it yet." Clara turned to look at him in surprise. "You never told me that. I was not sure you would want to hear it." "You married me for practical reasons, for escape and survival. I did not want to burden you with my feelings." "Virgil Zarrick, you are an idiot," Clara said, but her voice was full of affection. "I fell in love with you when you wrapped my hands so gently, when you gave me a choice instead of demands. Everything after that was just confirmation." They kissed as the sun set, two people who had found each other in desperate circumstances and built something beautiful through determination and mutual respect. Their children were healthy and happy. Their home was warm and welcoming. Their future stretched ahead full of possibilities. Inside the cabin, Victor peeked through the window at his parents and smiled before reporting back to Catherine. "They are kissing again. "Grown-ups are weird," Catherine pronounced with the wisdom of her 5 years. "Yeah," Victor agreed. "But I hope I find someone who makes me that happy someday." "Me too," Catherine said, and they settled back into their beds to dream of their own futures. Outside, Clara and Virgil remained on the porch long after the sun had set, watching the stars emerge one by one over the mountains they called home. Clara's hands, once cracked and bleeding from desperate labor, were now healed and strong, capable of building the life she had once only dreamed of. Virgil's heart, once locked away in solitary protection, was now open and full, overflowing with love for his family. They had taken a chance on each other when both were at their lowest points, and they had created something neither could have achieved alone. A partnership built on equality and respect, a home filled with love and laughter, a future bright with hope. The mountains that had once been Virgil's refuge from the world had become a sanctuary for all of them, a place where they could be exactly who they were without judgment or limitation. As they finally stood to go inside, Clara paused to look back at the view one more time. 10 years ago, she had been scrubbing laundry until her hands bled, certain that her life would be nothing but suffering and slow death. Now she was here, surrounded by beauty and love, with a husband who cherished her and children who made every day an adventure. "Thank you," she whispered to Virgil. "For what? For seeing me when I was invisible, for offering me a choice when I had none, for building this life with me." Virgil pulled her close, his arms strong and warm around her. "Clara, you saved me just as much as I saved you. Before you, I was just surviving. You taught me how to live." They went inside together, checked on their sleeping children, and climbed into the bed they shared. As Clara drifted off to sleep, wrapped in Virgil's arms, she thought about how strange life could be. One chance encounter, one moment of kindness, one impossible decision, and everything had changed. She had gambled everything on a mountain man who offered her healing salve and honest words, and she had won a jackpot beyond imagination. In the morning, there would be work to do. Animals to feed, children to teach, meals to cook, traps to check. But tonight, there was only warmth and peace and the quiet contentment of two people who had found exactly where they belonged. The mountains stood eternal around their cabin, and within those walls, love had built a home that would shelter them through whatever challenges the future might bring. Their story had begun with bleeding hands and desperate hope, but it had grown into something far greater, a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of choice, and the extraordinary things that can happen when two broken people decide to heal together. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the night wind whispered through the pines, that story continued, word by word, day by day, building toward a future as vast and full of promise as the wilderness that surrounded them. Years continued to pass in their mountain sanctuary, each season bringing its own rhythms and challenges. Victor grew into a tall, strong teenager who could track as well as his father and shoot better than most men twice his age. Catherine, meanwhile, developed a love for books that rivaled her mother's, and Clara taught her everything she knew about literature, history, and mathematics, using the small library they had accumulated through years of careful purchases during their trips to Fort Kearny. When Victor turned 16, a young woman named Sarah moved with her family to one of the valley homesteads. Clara watched with amusement as her son suddenly became very interested in helping their neighbors, volunteering for every task that might bring him into contact with the pretty blonde girl. Virgil, meanwhile, spent considerable time cleaning his rifles with excessive care whenever Sarah's father came to visit, sending a silent message about expectations regarding his son. "You are being ridiculous," Clara told her husband one evening. Victor is a good boy with a good heart. He is not going to do anything inappropriate. I know, Virgil admitted, but I remember what it was like to be 16 and interested in a girl. A little paternal intimidation never hurt anyone. Catherine rolled her eyes at both of them. I am never getting married, she announced. It makes people act foolish. Clara and Virgil exchanged glances and smiled, knowing full well that Catherine would likely change her tune in a few years. But for now, they let her maintain her certainty. The territory around them continued to develop. Fort Kearny grew into a proper town with a school, a church, and even a small newspaper. The railroad pushed further west, bringing more settlers and more changes. Some of the old mountain men like Virgil grumbled about the loss of wilderness, but Clara noted that her husband also seemed pleased when modern conveniences became more accessible. They built a third addition to their cabin, this one serving as a proper schoolroom where Clara taught not only her own children, but also the children of neighboring families. Word spread about the educated woman in the mountains who could teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, and soon Clara had a dozen students ranging from age 5 to 15. She charged nothing for her services, viewing education as a gift she could give to the community that had embraced her family. Virgil, meanwhile, had become something of a legend in the region. Stories circulated about the mountain man who could survive anything, who knew the wilderness like others knew their own gardens, who had once carried a wounded man 20 miles through a blizzard to save his life. Settlers sought his advice on everything from where to build their cabins to how to protect their livestock from predators. He gave his knowledge freely, remembering the kindness of the old French-Canadian trapper who had taught him to survive decades ago. On their 15th anniversary, Clara received an unexpected gift, a letter from Philadelphia. Her cousin Sarah, whom she had not heard from in years, had somehow tracked her down through a series of inquiries. The letter was full of news about family Clara had thought lost to her forever, relatives who had wondered what became of her after she left for the West. They want to visit, Clara said, reading the letter with tears in her eyes. Sarah and her husband are planning a trip west next summer and they want to stop and see us. Virgil looked worried. Will they judge our life here? We are not exactly civilized by Philadelphia standards. Clara laughed and kissed his cheek. Let them judge. I am proud of what we have built. Besides, Sarah was always the adventurous one in the family. She will probably love it here. When Sarah and her husband Edward arrived the following July, their reaction to the mountain cabin exceeded Clara's hopes. Sarah, a fashionable woman who looked distinctly out of place in her city clothes, took one look at the stunning mountain landscape and burst into tears. "Oh, Clara, it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she said, embracing her cousin. "How could you have kept this paradise secret all these years?" Edward, a banker from Philadelphia who had clearly expected to find his wife's cousin living in primitive squalor, was equally impressed by the neat cabin, the thriving garden, and the obvious contentment of the family. He and Virgil hit it off immediately. The banker fascinated by Virgil's knowledge of the wilderness and Virgil appreciating Edward's sharp mind and genuine interest. During their 2-week visit, Sarah fell completely in love with Victor and Catherine, declaring them the most well-adjusted children she had ever met. "City children are so pampered and soft," she told Clara. "Your children know how to work, how to think, how to appreciate beauty. You should be enormously proud." The visit strengthened Clara's connection to her past while affirming the rightness of her present. When Sarah and Edward left, they promised to visit again and to spread word among the family that Clara had not only survived but thrived in her Western life. More years passed, marked by the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that makes up any life. They lost neighbors to accidents and illness, welcomed new families to the area, celebrated marriages and births. Victor did eventually marry Sarah, the blonde girl from the valley, and they built their own cabin within a day's ride of Virgil and Clara's home. Catherine, despite her childhood declaration, fell in love with a young engineer who came west to work on the railroad, and after a courtship that lasted 2 years, she married him in a ceremony that brought together mountain folk and town people in equal measure. Virgil and Clara became grandparents 4 times over, and their cabin became a gathering place for the growing family. Virgil taught his grandchildren to track and hunt, just as he had taught Victor, while Clara read to them and taught them their lessons. The little boy who had once been Victor's tiny, red-faced infant was now a confident young father himself, and the cycle of life continued its eternal pattern. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Clara woke before dawn to find Virgil already up and sitting on their porch. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill and joined him, settling into the chair he had built for her years ago. "You are thinking deep thoughts," she observed. "I am thinking about time," Virgil said. 25 years ago, I walked into a laundry house and saw a woman destroying herself for pennies. If someone had told me then that she would become the center of my entire world, that she would give me children and grandchildren and a life I never imagined possible, I would have thought them insane. "And yet here we are," Clara said softly. "Here we are," Virgil agreed. He reached over and took her hand, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. "Clara, do you remember the promise I made? That if you gave me 1 year and hated mountain life, I would bring you back to civilization and set you up with enough money to start over." "I remember." "You never asked to leave, not once in 25 years. Clara smiled and squeezed his hand. "Why would I leave paradise? Everything I need is right here." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Their bodies were older now, marked by time and hard work, but their connection had only deepened with the years. They had built a legacy together, a family that spanned generations, a community strengthened by their contributions, a love that had proven resilient enough to weather every storm. "I want you to know something," Virgil said as the full light of day finally arrived. "These 25 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. You took a broken, lonely man and taught him how to be part of something larger than himself. You gave me purpose and love and a reason to build instead of just survive. I love you, Clara Zarrick, more with each passing day." Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "And I love you, Virgil. You saved my life in every way that matters. You gave me choice when I had none, respected me when the world dismissed me, built a partnership that has sustained us both. I cannot imagine having lived any other life than this one." Inside the cabin, they could hear their grandchildren beginning to wake, the sounds of a family gathering for a celebration. Friends and neighbors would arrive throughout the day, bringing food and stories, and well wishes for the couple who had become pillars of their mountain community. There would be music and laughter, reminiscences and toasts, a celebration of 25 years of marriage that had beaten impossible odds. But for now, in the quiet of early morning, there were just the two of them. The laundress, whose hands had once bled from desperate labor, and the mountain man, who had offered her healing salve and hope. They had taken that small act of kindness and built it into something magnificent, a love story that would be told around mountain fires for generations to come. As the sun climbed higher, and the sounds from inside the cabin grew louder, Clara and Virgil finally rose to greet their family and friends. They walked inside hand in hand, ready to celebrate the life they had created together, grateful for every moment of the journey that had brought them from desperation to joy, from isolation to community, from survival to truly living. Their story had no dramatic climax, no single moment of triumph. Instead, it was built from thousands of small moments. Hands held across a table, quiet conversations by firelight, shared work and shared dreams, children raised and grandchildren loved. It was the story of two people who had found each other when both were broken and had healed together, building something beautiful from the wreckage of their individual pasts. And as the party began and the cabin filled with laughter and love, Clara looked around at everything they had created and knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of their journey together. From bleeding hands in a Fort Kearny laundry to grandmother in a mountain paradise, every step had led her exactly where she belonged. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with neighbors sharing stories about Virgil and Clara's kindness over the years, children performing songs they had learned in Clara's informal school, and Victor giving a toast that left no dry eyes in the cabin. As darkness fell and guests began departing for their own homes, the family that remained gathered around the fire for quieter conversation. "Grandfather," one of the grandchildren asked, "how did you know grandmother was the one you wanted to marry?" Virgil looked at Clara with a smile. "I knew when I saw that despite everything trying to break her spirit, she refused to give up. Strength like that, combined with kindness and intelligence, that is worth more than all the gold in California." "And how did you know grandfather was worth marrying?" the child asked Clara. "He saw me when I was invisible," Clara answered simply. "He offered help without expecting anything in return, and he treated me like I mattered when the whole world had told me I did not. That is how you recognize a good man." The grandchildren absorbed this wisdom, storing it away for their own futures, and the evening wound down to its peaceful conclusion. When the last family member had finally departed and the cabin was quiet again, Clara and Virgil prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of 25 years of marriage. "Thank you," Clara said as they settled under their quilts. "For what specifically?" "I feel like I should be thanking you for approximately 1,000 things," Virgil replied. "For being exactly who you are, for building this life with me, for making every day an adventure even when we are just doing ordinary things." Clara nestled against his side. "For proving that sometimes the most improbable choices lead to the most extraordinary outcomes." "Well then, thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who barely remembered how to have a conversation. Thank you for civilizing me just enough while letting me stay wild where it counted. Thank you for our children and grandchildren and this beautiful, chaotic, perfect life." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the same way they had fallen asleep thousands of nights before, and the mountains stood watch over them as they always had. The wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. But inside the cabin, all was warm and peaceful and full of love. And so their story continued, not with a dramatic ending but with the quiet continuation of a life well lived. They would have more anniversaries, more grandchildren, more seasons of work and joy and sorrow. They would face challenges and celebrate triumphs, always together, always partners in everything that mattered. The woman whose hands had once bled from desperation now used those same hands to hold grandchildren, to tend her garden, to clasp her husband's hand across the table every morning. The mountain man who had once believed himself destined for solitude now woke each day grateful for the noise and chaos of family, for the warmth of his wife beside him, for the legacy they had built together. Their love had not been born from passion or drama, but from mutual respect, shared struggles, and the simple decision to build something together. It had grown slowly and steadily, like a tree putting down roots in mountain soil, until it was strong enough to weather any storm. And it would endure, passing down through generations as an example of what two people could create when they chose partnership over pride, healing over hurt, hope over despair. In the end, that was the true happy ending. Not a single moment of triumph, but a lifetime of moments strung together like beads on a string, each one precious, each one part of the larger story. A story that began with bleeding hands and healing salve and grew into something neither of them could have imagined but both treasured beyond measure. And they lived it fully, right up until their final days, grateful for every moment they had been given and every moment they had created together. Their story became part of the mountain legend, told and retold until the details blurred but the essence remained clear. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, and sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that start not with fireworks, but with a simple act of kindness between two desperate souls who decided to save each other.